Hello, I'm Andrew Kamei-Deitch, and we're continuing our look at pre-modern Japan. Today's topic, the Nara Period, an age of Buddhism and Chinese knowledge. Now I'm going to start by pointing to a couple of key points. The Nara Period is a time of great change when, facing overseas and domestic pressures, Japanese rulers consolidated their rule. And the second point, this new era was represented by the capital itself, Nara, a political, economic, and cultural center which set the tone for the dawn of Japan's classical age. Now we start by looking at the Asuka period, which connects together the Kofun period we looked at last time and the Nara period that's going to take up most of our time today. There's a couple of things to note about the Asuka period. So first of all, we have literacy becoming widespread at the court. This is the time when we start to find the first historical records. Another major development is the arrival of Buddhism from Baekje. Now, Baekje is one of the three Korean kingdoms and was something of a Japanese ally in ancient times. And at one point, as a reward for services rendered during the struggles in Korea, Baekje introduced Buddhism to Japan. One of the interesting things to note is that the missionaries, when they arrived with all of the knowledge and information about Buddhism, they didn't say to the Japanese court that this is some kind of great religious tradition we're giving you. They said this is an interesting tool of statecraft that can help you rule. So this tells us something, but when Buddhism first comes into Japan, it's already associated not with a type of liberational religious tradition per se, but actually with politics right from the start. Another important thing we have in the Asuka period, we have the spread of Chinese knowledge, goods, and customs. And this is enabled by something that we later came to call the Silk Road, a massive trading network that connected the eastern part of the Western world all the way across to Asia. And finally, another key development in the Asuka period is something called the Ritsu roll system. And this is a series of land and law codes that were based on Tang Dynasty China. At the time, the Tang Dynasty was the most powerful country in East Asia and may have been even the most powerful empire in the world. In fact, it has been referred to by some scholars as a medieval superpower, just as a sign of how great its influence and power was. Now, the Silk Road that I was talking about here is just a rough sketch about the main parts of those routes. You can see that it runs from Europe all the way over here, through Persia and India down into China. And so through its connection to Korea and the continent, this is how Japan is able to access that route. And therefore not just bring in goods from China, but also things from other countries as well, connected to the same network. The Nara period, you might recall a moment ago I said that it's a time of, on the one hand, overseas pressure, and on the other hand, domestic pressure. Now, let's start with the overseas issue. First of all, we have a unified Korea. Now, this is obviously a concern for Japan because Korea had been broken into three kingdoms for a long time, many centuries of conflict. Historically, when countries that have been divided come together and form unified states, they tend to have a higher chance of becoming aggressive to their neighbors. And so, understandably, there was a concern in Japan that a strong, new, unified Korea might become a military threat. At the same time, there was a very powerful China next door as well. Because again, the Tang Dynasty, that medieval superpower, it's right there and very, very powerful, and it's already shown that it's interested in expanding its influence into other regions. So again, people in Japan at the time, they're aware of this development and they're a little bit concerned. At the same time, we have domestic pressures because there had been a change in royal lines. There had been a shift from one brother's line of descent to another within the Japanese royal family. And so the new rulers, their family was standing on a little bit of unsteady ground concerning their legitimacy. They wanted, on the one hand, to prove that they were legitimate and deserved to rule the country. They also wanted to keep the country strong. To bring this about, they launched a series of reforms. We see that new words at this time became standardized. We have the word Nippon for the first time starts to become used as a standard term for the Japanese territory. We also have Tenno, the heavenly sovereign, starts to be used as the term for the Japanese ruler instead of the older terms like great king. There's a well-organized government based on the Chinese system. Now, imitating this type of system from China was not something that was only done by Japan. It was also followed by other kingdoms as well within the Asian sphere. This was because, as I mentioned, the Tang dynasty was extremely powerful and influential, so many other countries imitated what they believed to be the strongest parts of those systems. There was also strong government support for religious organizations. This was not just because of any kind of support for the ideas of the religions themselves, but because of the government's desperate need to shore up their legitimacy. So one of the ways that you can do that is to try to gain religious legitimacy by encouraging religious institutions to support you. And it's also the time when we have the official histories, Nihon Shoki and Kojiki, compiled. Of course, a large part of those histories was based on older myth and legend that had been passed down from oral tradition. But at this point, they were officially compiled as texts for the first time, and a strong element of that compilation process was designed to show that the current ruling family was legitimate and deserved to continue to rule the country. Well, were they successful? Essentially, we can say yes. The results of this were, first of all, a stronger and more sophisticated state, and second, it established Japan as a distinct independent country with its own royals and its own traditions that was culturally and politically distinct from China. Second thing I want to do now is to talk about Nara itself, the capital city, which reflects so much of the society and culture of the period. Now, the new capital was located in Heijō-kyo, nowadays called Nara, and the design was based on the Chinese capital of Chang'an. Now, at the time, Heijō-kyo was a very large city. It had a population of about 100,000 people, which was very significant by the standards of the time, and this rapidly became the center of Japan's political and economic world. Here we have an illustration of what Chang'an, the Tang dynasty capital, looked like. You can see that there is a clear type of layout here. We have the royal palace in the middle, and then we have the whole city divided into a western and eastern side with markets structured all along this careful grid pattern with these intersecting streets. This became the model for other capital cities around East Asia, and in this regard, Heijō-kyo was no exception. So we see a similar type of layout here. We have the royal palace right at the top, so that of course facing south, and then we have the division of the city into western and eastern parts, all carefully laid out in the same type of grid division. What about Nara culture? Well, the city Nara was not just the center of the political and economic world, it was also the center of the religious, artistic, and cultural worlds at the time. This was where the major temples and the monasteries were located, especially Todaiji. It was also the center of the schools and the great emphasis at the time that was put on Chinese learning, particularly in the areas of medicine and technology. Here we have a picture of the great Buddha, the Daibutsu, at Todaiji, which was a major project and rapidly became a major pilgrimage spot for believers. Now, Buddhism at the time was very much a religion of the upper classes and the urban elite, but it slowly expanded throughout society. And as we'll see in a later lecture, eventually more popular types of Buddhism also took root in Japan. Another point to consider with Nara culture is the dawn of great literature. We have both Chinese style and Japanese style poetry at this time. And we also have the development of printing. Now, printing is probably something you associate with Western Europe and Gutenberg, but actually other societies have had types of printing even in ancient times. And in Japan, we have an example of some of the earliest printing in East Asia. Shotoku Tenno carried out a project called the Hyakuman Todarani in the year 764. And this project was designed to reward all of the temples that had been supporting the state by taking a Buddhist sutra and duplicating it and then sending it out to the temples in these little pagodas. So this is what they look like. Here we have two of the extant pagodas and the printed text. One of the things that's particularly significant about this is that these texts have a very smooth type of printing method that appears to have been used. Likely they weren't printed using wood blocks, which deteriorate over time, but probably with a type of metal plate, which really would have been innovative at the time. So, I think we can say that the Nara period was a time of important changes. There was influence from the overseas, and this combined with local developments to create a new society centered at the capital city, Nara. Thank you very much.